The river was calm that evening, the water gliding over smooth stones as the last slivers of daylight reflected off its surface. The gentle rustling of leaves in the warm summer breeze mixed with the occasional chirping of insects. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you only find deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where the world feels untouched and time slows to a crawl. My boyfriend, Noah, was already half asleep in his hammock, rocking slightly as he exhaled a slow, lazy breath. Our dog, Juniper, lay curled up beside me on a towel near the tent, her ears twitching with the distant sounds of the forest. We had spent the day kayaking down the river, and after a few stressful moments navigating the rapids, we were exhausted. All we wanted was to relax, to let the tension slip away as the evening settled around us. We had eaten a couple of edibles earlier, knowing it would make everything feel even more serene. I was lying back, staring up at the sky as the first stars began to emerge, when I heard footsteps on the trail. At first, I didn't think much of it. The Appalachian Trail was well-traveled, and hikers passed by all the time. Our campsite was only about 10 feet from the path, nestled just between the trail and the river. Still, something about the rhythm of these footsteps made me pause. They were slow, measured, deliberate. Juniper lifted her head, her ears standing at attention. A moment later, a man stepped into view. He was tall, lean, and sunburned, his blonde hair a little too long, sticking to the sweat on his forehead. He wore an Appalachian Trail shirt, the kind you see serious thru-hikers wearing, and a heavy backpack that looked like it had seen miles of wear. "Hey there," he said, his voice friendly but off, like he was too eager, forcing casualness into his tone. I sat up slightly, glancing at Noah, who hadn't moved. "Hey," I replied. The man took another step toward us, standing just outside our camp. "Listen, I was wondering, would you mind taking my trash?" I blinked. His trash? I looked past him. The nearest town was just a 5-minute walk down the trail. There were dumpsters right there. There's a place to throw it out just down the trail," I said, gesturing in that direction. He didn't even look. Instead, he smiled, shifting his backpack slightly before reaching inside. "Tell you what," he said, pulling out a large bag of weed. "I'll give you some if you take my trash." I hesitated. The offer was weird, but honestly, I wasn't going to turn down free weed. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Why not?" He grinned, handing me a small handful of nugs, then dumped his trash into our bag without another word. I expected him to leave, but he didn't. Instead, he lingered, glancing around as if considering something. Then he asked, "Mind if I hang out for a bit?" I hesitated. He seemed normal enough, just another hiker looking for some company. But something about the way he stood, the way he watched me, made me uneasy. Still, I didn't want to be rude. Sure," I said. He sat down, dropping his backpack beside him. That's when Noah stirred, lifting his head slightly from the hammock. The hiker flinched. It was subtle, but I saw it, the brief look of surprise in his eyes before he quickly masked it with another smile. I felt my stomach twist. He hadn't realized Noah was here. He thought I was alone. That was why he stopped. I forced a casual smile, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. Noah sat up fully, rubbing his eyes. "Hey," he mumbled. The hiker nodded at him. "Hey, man." He was still smiling, but it was different now, tighter. We started talking, small stuff about the trail, where he had been, where he was heading. He told us he had been hiking for months, making his way from Georgia, hoping to reach Maine before the season ended. I wanted to believe him, but the longer he talked, the weirder things got. Noah and I lit up a joint, and out of courtesy, we offered him a hit. He took it, inhaled deeply, too deeply, then let out a fit of violent coughing. And then, it was like a switch flipped. He started muttering. At first, I thought he was just high, but his voice was so low, almost like he was talking to himself. He would stare out at the river, lips moving, eyes unfocused. Every once in a while, he would look at us, as if we were part of the conversation, but we couldn't understand a single word he was saying. I glanced at Noah, who was watching him with the same unease I felt. Then, out of nowhere, the hiker spoke up, clear as day. "On a scale of 1 to 10, he said, "how much do I seem like a serial killer?" A cold chill ran through me. Noah and I exchanged a glance, both forcing awkward laughter. "Oh, definitely a 1, I said quickly. "Not at all." The man smiled, but his eyes didn't. That was the moment I knew we had made a mistake. I pulled my knees up to my chest, suddenly desperate for distance. He lit a cigarette. "I'll finish this and then head out," he muttered. I watched the glowing tip of the cigarette, counting the seconds. It was the longest cigarette I had ever seen. Every time he took a drag, I willed it to burn faster. Finally, he stood, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "Well," he said, "guess I should get going." We nodded, forcing polite smiles. He turned and walked away, but not far. The trail stretched for miles in both directions. We knew he wouldn't go too far before setting up camp, and we were alone out here. Noah and I sat in silence, listening for footsteps returning, listening for the zipper of our tent opening, listening for the snap of a branch nearby. Juniper let out a low whimper, pressing closer to my side. We stayed awake all night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline spiking through my veins. In the dark, we made a plan. If he came back, we would grab Juniper and jump into the river, letting the current carry us downstream to the boat ramp. But he never came back. The next morning, we packed up quickly, not even bothering to eat breakfast. As we walked down the trail, passing other hikers, I kept searching faces, looking for him. But he was gone. And yet, somehow, I knew. He had been watching us all night. It was late fall, and the night air was crisp as I drove home from class at the community college in Asheville. I had been taking night courses in automotive mechanics, working toward my certification. My schedule was tight, working mornings, classes in the evening, home by 10:30 p.m. at the latest. This particular night, I was dead tired, and all I wanted was to get home, eat something, and pass out. I decided to stay on I-40 instead of taking my usual backroad detour. It was faster, easier. But as soon as I took the exit toward my parents' house, something felt wrong. The darkness felt heavier than usual. I rolled down my window, letting the night air in, but all I got was silence. Not a single cricket, not a single rustling leaf. No wind, just nothing. My gut clenched, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe I was just overtired. I passed by the old truck stop, the one that was always open 24/7. Except tonight, for the first time in my life, the lights were off. That was the first sign. I kept driving, my old Dodge pickup rattling as it rolled down the dark, winding road. The trees along the edges of the pavement felt taller somehow, stretching toward the sky, their jagged silhouettes blocking out what little moonlight there was. Then I saw it. A dog. At least, that's what I thought at first. It ran out into the road just 10 feet in front of me, moving so fast I barely had time to react. I slammed the brakes, tires screeching as I skidded forward. There was a sickening thud, then silence. My heart was hammering. I sat there for a second, hands clenched around the steering wheel, breathing hard. I had just hit someone's dog. Shit. I threw the truck in reverse, backing up slowly until my taillights illuminated the road behind me. And that's when I saw it. The dog was standing up, not on 4 legs, on 2. My stomach dropped. The thing was massive, easily over 10 feet tall. Its thin, skeletal frame hunched slightly under the glow of my reverse lights. Its skin hung loose in patches, like an old, rotting animal hide. Where there should have been fur, there was only filthy, matted clumps of hair, clinging to its emaciated body like mold on a corpse. It was looking at me. I couldn't see eyes, just 2 empty black sockets, staring straight through the glass, straight through me. My whole body locked up. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. I should have driven away. I should have slammed my foot on the gas and never looked back. But I didn't. Because, in that moment, I couldn't move. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. And then, it smiled. Its mouth was too wide, stretching across its gaunt face in an unnatural, jagged grin. And its teeth. God, its teeth didn't make sense. They weren't arranged like a normal animal's. They were stacked, spilling out of its mouth, layer upon layer, like something that had too many teeth and not enough space. I was going to be sick. Then the thing took a step toward me. That snapped me out of it. I slammed the truck into first gear and hit the gas so hard the tires screeched, burning rubber as I tore down the road. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. My whole body was shaking, but in my rearview mirror, it was running after me, not on all 4s, on 2 legs. Its gait was wrong, its long, bony arms swinging unnaturally as it sprinted after my truck, covering impossible ground with each step. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared, but the thing kept up. I could hear it laughing. A sound like bones rattling in a dry throat, like something that had never laughed before and didn't quite understand how. And then, a light. Someone's porch light flicked on just up the road. And just like that, it stopped. It snapped its head toward the light, its entire body going rigid. Then, without another sound, it turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't breathe until I pulled into my parents' driveway, tires kicking up gravel as I slammed the truck into park. I ran inside, locking the door behind me, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't tell them. I couldn't. Who the hell would believe me? But I didn't sleep that night, because the smell was still there. That rotting flesh smell, the one I had first noticed in my truck, had followed me home. And deep in the woods behind the house, just beyond the tree line, something was watching. The thing didn't leave me alone. It followed me. For weeks, I would catch glimpses of it. A shadow too tall to be human. A shape shifting between trees in the dead of night. And the laughing. I would wake up in the middle of the night to that dry, rattling laugh outside my window. One night, I finally saw it again. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep. And then I smelled it. The scent of rotting death. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. And there it was, standing in the yard, watching me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, until I turned on the porch light. Then, as if the light had physically burned it, the thing lurched backward, its form flickering at the edges like it wasn't entirely there. And then it vanished. I never saw it again after that. But sometimes, when I drive those dark, winding roads at night, I swear I can still hear it. That low, bone-dry laugh, hiding somewhere deep in the woods, waiting. I was 11 years old the first time I saw it. Back then, I didn't have the words to explain what I had witnessed. I barely even had the courage to admit it to myself. But it was real. It was real, and it had been watching me. My family lived in a holler in rural Kentucky, deep in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The kind of place where the nearest town was 30 minutes away and cell service was practically non-existent. I lived with my dad and my grandma in a double-wide trailer, surrounded by nothing but thick woods and the occasional stretch of farmland. We had no neighbors, just miles of trees behind us and a narrow, winding road leading out to civilization. The isolation never really bothered me. Not at first. But my grandma had rules. They seemed weird at the time, strict, random, even superstitious. Don't go into the woods alone. If you hear your name, don't answer. If you see someone in the woods you recognize, no, you didn't. I used to roll my eyes at them. But I followed them, because she meant them. I found out why the night of the storm. It was late summer, one of those humid August nights where the air felt thick with something unspoken. My dad and I had set up a small campsite about a quarter-mile from the trailer, in a clearing surrounded by berry bushes and tall grass. We had spent the whole day outside, cooking over the fire, watching the sky shift from blue to deep purple, and listening to the distant sounds of the forest. When it got dark, Dad decided to run back to the house for more beer. "You good here, bud?" he asked as he stood, stretching. I nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "Don't mess with the fire," he warned, pointing at me before disappearing into the woods. I was used to being left at the campsite alone. It never scared me before. But that night was different. Because the second he was gone, the woods went silent. The wind died. The crickets stopped chirping. Even the distant rush of the stream sounded muffled, like it had been swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness around me. I sat up straighter, suddenly aware of how alone I was. And then, I smelled it. A sharp, metallic tang filled my nose, making me gag. It was strong, almost like burning metal, thick and unnatural. It clung to the air, coating the back of my throat. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face, trying to clear the scent. That's when I heard the branches snap. I froze. It came from the tree line, just beyond the fire's glow. I squinted into the darkness, searching for movement. The fire crackled. Shadows flickered against the trees, stretching long and thin. For a long moment, there was nothing. And then, in a flash of lightning, I saw it. A shape. Tall. Human-like. Standing just past the first row of trees. Then the darkness swallowed it again. I held my breath, heart slamming against my ribs. The next flash of lightning came seconds later. Closer this time. The figure had moved. It was standing at the edge of the clearing. I shot to my feet, blood turning to ice. My voice caught in my throat. I wanted to call for Dad. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move, because with each blinding burst of lightning, I saw it getting closer. It wasn't walking. It wasn't running. It was just there, closing the distance in the impossible seconds between flashes of light. First at the trees, then by the berry bushes, then standing in the middle of the campsite. The smell of burning metal filled my lungs, burning my throat. I gasped. And then the lightning stopped. I was plunged into pitch blackness, and something breathed right next to my ear. I don't remember running. 1 second, I was frozen in place. The next, I was sprinting through the woods, branches slashing at my arms, my bare feet pounding against the dirt. I could still smell it, that metallic, rotting stench, thick as fog around me. Somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps. But they weren't normal footsteps. They were heavy, uneven, like whatever was following me wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. I burst into the clearing by the trailer, nearly collapsing onto the porch. The front door swung open before I even touched it. Grandma stood there, her face pale, terrified. She grabbed me and yanked me inside, slamming the door shut behind me. What happened? She demanded. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe, but I could still smell it. Even inside the house, I could still smell it. Grandma must have smelled it too, because her expression hardened. She locked every door, every window, then grabbed a handful of salt from the kitchen and began sprinkling it along the windowsills. Dad walked in a few minutes later, carrying his beer. He took one look at me, shaking on the couch, and frowned. What happened? Grandma didn't even look at him. He saw it. Dad's face paled. He set the beer down. Didn't ask any more questions. Just locked the back door. I didn't sleep that night. And by morning, the tent at the campsite was destroyed. The canvas was shredded, ripped open in long, jagged tears. No claw marks. No tracks. Just the strong, lingering scent of burning metal in the air. I wasn't allowed outside alone after that. For 3 weeks, Dad waited with me at the bus stop every morning. For 3 weeks, Grandma made me sleep with salt under my pillow. For 3 weeks, I wasn't allowed to talk about what I saw. And for 3 weeks, I knew something was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I didn't understand it back then. Not until years later, when I tried telling the story at a family gathering. I barely got a sentence in before my aunt cut me off. Her face went pale. Don't you dare talk about that. Don't you put that evil on us. I shut up real quick, because I realized something then. I wasn't the first person in my family to see it, and I sure as hell wouldn't be the last. I always thought the scariest part of hiking alone would be the isolation, the vast emptiness of the wilderness, the knowledge that no one would hear you scream if something went wrong. I was wrong. The scariest part isn't being alone. It's realizing you aren't. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for over a month when it happened. It was something I had always dreamed of doing, a solo trek through the mountains, just me and the trail. I wanted the challenge, the solitude, the chance to push myself further than I ever had before. For weeks, it was exactly what I had hoped for. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of birds calling through the mist. I spent my days walking through ancient forests, following trails carved into the land centuries before I was born. At night, I made camp beneath a sky so clear that the stars looked close enough to touch. I was careful. I followed the rules. I checked in with rangers when I could. I carried bear spray. I never strayed from the trail. But none of that mattered. Because there are things in those woods that don't care how prepared you are. Things that watch. Things that wait. And some of them don't want you to leave. The first time I noticed it, I had just set up camp near a small creek. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. I had spent the day pushing hard, covering more miles than I intended, and my body ached with exhaustion. As I unpacked my gear, I felt it, that prickle at the back of my neck. The kind of feeling you get when someone's staring at you. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. The woods were silent. Too silent. I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling my camp. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife so tightly my fingers ached. I told myself it was an animal, until I heard it breathe. Long, shuddering breaths, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just lay there, waiting. And eventually, the footsteps faded. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found footprints outside my tent. Bare footprints. Human footprints. They circled my camp, weaving between the trees before vanishing into the underbrush. I packed my gear as fast as I could. I told myself it was a fluke, some drifter passing through, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. I walked fast that day, faster than usual. I wanted to get as far away from that spot as possible. But the feeling never left me. That prickle at the back of my neck. The certainty that someone was watching. It got worse after that. I started noticing small things. Little signs that I wasn't alone. A pile of rocks near my tent that hadn't been there before. A carved symbol on a tree that I didn't recognize. My backpack unzipped when I knew I had closed it. And at night, the footsteps always came back. Always circling. Always breathing. But never speaking. I decided to leave the trail early. I had planned to hike another month, but I couldn't. I had lost too much sleep. My nerves were shot. I just wanted to be somewhere safe. I mapped out a route that would take me to a ranger station in 2 days. If I pushed hard, I could make it sooner. I never made it that far. That night, I camped in a clearing at the base of a ridge. It was a bad spot, too open, too exposed, but I was too exhausted to care. I built a fire, ate my dinner, forced myself to pretend I wasn't terrified. And then, as the fire crackled and the sky darkened, I saw something in the trees. 2 figures, standing just at the edge of the firelight. I went ice cold. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were just standing there, watching me. I couldn't see their faces. I could barely even tell if they were human, but I felt them staring. I grabbed my knife, my bear spray, anything I could use to defend myself. Then I called out, "Hello?" Nothing. "Do you need something?" Silence. I took a step closer, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles turned white. That's when I saw their clothes, or what was left of them. Tattered, filthy rags, clinging to their skeletal frames. Their bodies were thin, too thin, like they hadn't eaten in months. And their faces. Jesus. Their faces were wrong. Hollow eyes. Lips cracked and peeled back into permanent grits. Like they had forgotten how to be people. I stepped back, and in perfect unison, they stepped forward. I ran. I didn't think. I just grabbed my pack and sprinted into the dark, my fire still burning behind me. I could hear them following. I could hear their breathing. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until I collapsed in a heap of leaves and dirt, gasping for air. And when I finally looked back, they were gone. I don't know how long I lay there. I just know that by the time I finally got up, the sun was rising. I walked for hours, and when I finally found a road, a real road, I cried. I made it to a town by nightfall. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and didn't leave for 2 days. I told myself I would report it. I never did, because deep down I knew. Those weren't just lost hikers. They weren't normal. They had been out there a long time. Maybe once, a long time ago, they had been like me, just people looking for adventure. But the mountains had changed them, and they had been waiting for me to join them. I was 13 years old the first time I heard the whistling. It was late fall, the kind of crisp Appalachian night where the air smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke, and the wind carried a biting chill that made you pull your jacket a little tighter. I was staying at my grandparents' house in West Virginia, a small, weathered home tucked between rolling hills and thick stretches of forest. They had lived there their entire lives, in a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in less than 10 minutes. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where folks knew when to mind their business, and where certain things just weren't talked about. I should have listened. That night, I was restless. I wasn't used to how quiet it was there. Back home, I had the distant hum of traffic, the occasional sirens, the muffled voices of neighbors through thin apartment walls. Here, there was nothing. Just the wind, the creak of old wood, and the sound of tree branches scraping against the side of the house like fingernails on glass. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. And then, I heard it. A low, distant whistle floating through the trees. It was coming from outside. The sound was strange, carrying in a way that made it impossible to tell how far away it was. It wasn't a melody, just 2 sharp notes, repeating over and over again. At first, I thought it might be the wind. But as I listened, I realized something was off. The wind didn't move in patterns. The wind didn't pause, didn't start and stop with the precision of something that was alive. I sat up, the blankets pooling around my waist. The whistle came again. Closer this time. I slid out of bed and crept toward the window, peeking through the thin lace curtains. The backyard stretched out into darkness, the forest looming just beyond the fence. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their skeletal branches shifting against the sky. But there was nothing there. Just the trees. Just the night. Just the whistle, now right at the edge of the woods. I turned away from the window, swallowing hard. I had the sudden, unsettling certainty that if I stayed there too long, something would be watching me from the trees. Something that would see me before I saw it. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from the monster under their bed. And I didn't sleep until the whistling stopped. The next morning, I asked my grandpa about it. I expected him to brush it off, to tell me it was just an animal, or the wind, or my imagination. But he didn't. Instead, he went rigid, his weathered hands tightening around his coffee mug. He exchanged a look with my grandma, something silent and heavy passing between them. Then, without a word, he stood up, walked to the back door, and locked it. I stared at him. "What?" I asked, my voice small. He didn't answer. Neither did my grandma. The conversation was over, and we didn't talk about it again. That should have been the end of it. I should have let it go, but I didn't. Because the next night, the whistling came back. And this time, it was closer. I woke up to the sound of Junebug, my grandparents' old bloodhound, whining at the back door. She never did that. During the day, she was loud, always barking at squirrels, howling at passing cars. But at night, she was quiet. She never begged to go outside. Tonight, though, she was frantic. Her nails scratched against the wood. Her breathing was loud, uneven. And outside, past the thin walls of the house, the whistling had returned. It was just beyond the backyard now, just past the fence. That same two-note call, low and sharp. I slid out of bed, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I moved slowly, heart pounding in my ears, creeping toward the window like I was moving through a nightmare. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I peeled back the curtain and froze. The trees were still there, stretching into the dark. The wind was still moving through the leaves. And just beyond the fence, standing at the edge of the woods, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person. But the longer I stared, the less sure I became. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its body too thin. And its face, it didn't have one. Just a smooth, pale shape where a face should have been. Then, slowly it lifted a hand and beckoned me. I stumbled backward, slamming my heel into the nightstand. The lamp rattled, my breath catching in my throat. And outside, the whistling stopped. The house was silent. Even Junebug had gone still. I sat there for what felt like forever, knees drawn to my chest, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When I finally got the courage to look again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept waiting for the whistling to return, but it didn't. Not that night, not the next, not for the rest of the time I stayed there. It wasn't until years later, when I was older, when I had finally built up the nerve to ask my grandpa again, that I learned the truth. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. He was older now, more tired, his hand shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. I took a deep breath. "Grandpa," I said, "that whistling, what was it?" He exhaled, smoke curling into the evening air. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then he looked at me, and I saw something in his face I had never seen before. "Fear. You heard it?" he finally asked. I nodded. He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I hoped you wouldn't." He took another drag, his eyes dark, distant. Then he said something I will never forget. "It knows who hears it." A cold shiver ran through me. What does that mean? He flicked the ash from his cigarette. "Means if you heard it once, you'll hear it again." I stared at him, my stomach twisting, but he wouldn't say anything else. He just sat there, looking out at the woods, listening, waiting. And now, every once in a while, late at night, when the wind is still, I hear it, that same low, sharp whistle, calling to me, from the dark. The first time I heard about the wolves of Appalachia, I laughed. I had just moved to a small town nestled deep in the mountains, a place where everyone knew everyone, and outsiders, especially city folk like me, were met with polite but wary smiles. I wasn't looking for trouble, just a fresh start. I had spent the past 10 years grinding away in a corporate job that drained me dry, barely scraping by in an apartment that never felt like home. Then, out of nowhere, my uncle died and left me his house, a rundown cabin at the edge of town, sitting on a few acres of untouched wilderness. It was a gift, a chance to start over. I packed my things, quit my job, and drove halfway across the country, eager to leave the noise of the city behind. The town was small, but it had charm, old brick buildings, a diner that hadn't changed in 50 years, a general store that doubled as a bar. But the locals? They were strange. Not unfriendly, just cautious. Especially when they found out where I was living. "You're out by the ridge?" the old man at the hardware store asked, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "Yeah," I said, setting a bag of nails on the counter. "My uncle left me his place." The old man let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Don't go wandering at night," he said. I forced a chuckle. "What, are the bears bad around here?" His eyes darkened. "Ain't bears you gotta worry about." I thought he was messing with me, but he wasn't. The first few nights in the cabin were quiet. Too quiet. I wasn't used to it. Back in the city, I slept through sirens, traffic, the hum of a million lives moving all around me. Here, there was nothing. No cars. No voices. Just the wind slipping through the trees and the occasional creak of the old house settling. The first time I heard the howling, I barely noticed it. It was distant, carried by the wind, something I chalked up to coyotes or maybe even a stray dog. But by the third night, it was closer. And there was something wrong about it. It wasn't just one howl. It was many. Dozens of voices tangled together in an eerie, unnatural harmony, low and guttural, like laughter twisted into something feral. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck. I told myself it was nothing. But that night, I locked every door. The next morning, I found bones in my yard. Not little ones, either. They were big deer, maybe even elk, scattered across the grass like something had just dropped them there. Some of them were broken in half, snapped within human strength. Others had teeth marks. Long, deep. Too big for any normal animal. I stared at them for a long time, unease curling in my gut. Something had left them for me to find. That's when I remembered what the old man at the store had said. "Ain't bears you gotta worry about." I didn't laugh anymore. I went into town that afternoon, hoping to ask around, see if anyone else had noticed strange things happening. But the second I mentioned the howling, the conversation stopped. The woman at the diner who had been so friendly before suddenly wouldn't look at me. The guy at the general store who had joked with me the other day just shook his head. And the old man at the hardware store? He gave me a look, a deep, knowing frown, like he had already expected this. "You didn't touch anything, did you?" he asked. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Bones," he said. "Did you touch any bones?" I hesitated. "Yeah." His face darkened. "Jesus Christ, kid." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. "You don't touch the bones." I swallowed. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me, toward the window, his expression tense. Then he said, "Because now they know you're there." That night, the howling came back. Louder. Closer. The sound wrapped around the house like a living thing, slipping through the cracks, vibrating against the walls. I sat in my chair, shotgun across my lap, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The wind howled. The trees shook. Then, a thud on the porch. I stopped breathing. Slowly, I stood, my legs shaking beneath me. The thud came again. Heavy. Rhythmic. Something was walking on my porch. I crept toward the window, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to pretend I wasn't there. But I had to look. I had to see. I pulled back the curtain eye. And there, standing on my porch, was something impossible. It had the body of a man, but it was too tall, its limbs too long and thin. Its head was wrong, elongated, the snout stretching too far forward, lips curled back in a mockery of a grin. Its eyes, God, its eyes were pure black, glistening in the dim porch light, locked directly onto mine. It knew I was watching. It raised one long, clawed hand, and it knocked on the door. 3 slow knocks. Like a person, like a visitor, like it was waiting to be let inside. I stumbled backward, choking on my own breath. The knocking stopped. The air was so silent, I could hear my own pulse pounding. Then, it laughed. A low, dry chuckle, like wind through dead leaves. And then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't waste time. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I just threw everything into my truck and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until the mountains were just a dark blur in my rearview mirror. I never went back. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear the howling. And worse, sometimes I hear the knocking too.